Well, okay, as you can see, our covering job is coming along quite nicely. I have already affixed the tissue to the top of the wing, but as I told you earlier, I was not going to shrink it. What we did is we used the glue stick. I showed you previously using this glue stick. Well, I ran out with this one, only kept it so I could show you. I found an even better one if you get the Elmer's washable school glue stick, and it's actually, get the lid off, it's purple. This stuff works even better than the Avery stuff that I was using, so you might want to check that out. In the video here, you may be able to see there's some funny lines in here. Well, what I tried to do when I realized that I had run out of glue in my glue stick, I tried using, just the regular mixture of glue, the Elmer's white glue mixed with water, thinned 50-50, and I set the dry sheet on it, and then I realized I was crooked, so I picked it up. So there's some little marks in there. They'll go away after we shrink everything down and treat it. But it worked out really good. I did this wing panel with this new purple glue stick. Worked really well. And after it was all put in place, I went back with my thinned 50-50 water in this and my little paintbrush, like so, and I went in and sealed all the edges as I took the sheet and rolled it over. I sealed all the edges and let that dry. So basically, I'm ready to shrink it. Now again, the bottom we did old school, where I had put the wet tissue in place, and then the top I put it on with the glue stick and dry tissue. So this dry tissue still needs to be shrunk down. Now I'm using an old hairspray bottle. I showed you that because it has a atomization on it, and I don't know if I can show it, but instead of it, making a big bunch of big drops, it does, a real fine mist. This is what I'm going to use. Now, one of the things that I have noticed is with the tissue that we're using, we're not using true model airplane covering tissue. What we're using is, packaging tissue or present wrapping tissue or whatever. It's been working really good so far. However, because it's so thin, I'm afraid that this method of putting it on dry and then going back and shrinking it, I'm afraid that when it gets wet, it might try to shrink too much. So in this bottle, what I've actually got is about a 70% mixture of water to about a 30% mixture of isopropanol. So just regular rubbing alcohol. And what that alcohol does is it's going to flash off and evaporate much quicker, and it should give us, if I'm not mistaken, it should help us to control the amount of shrink that we have. So at this point, all I'm going to do is simply take my mister bottle and just do a solid mist over all of this tissue. And of course it's going to wrinkle up nicely. Looks kind of funky, but that's okay. Trying to hold it here. And at that point, boy, it really makes it translucent. Now we've got it. Now I'm just going to set it up here flat and let it dry. And I'll let it dry off camera because I'm going to turn my lights off. These lights create so much heat, I'm afraid it's going to cause it to dry too fast. But I'll join you back in a minute. We should have this all shrunk down and ready to do our sealing coat. We'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, what you see here, if the camera is showing it well, you're going to be able to see that we have a very nicely shrunk down tissue covering on this wing. But you're also going to be able to tell, probably from our shot, that we've got a little shine going on here. When you have the paper, once you have the paper shrunk down like we did, as a recap, remember we put the bottom the bottom sheets on using painting everything down, all the balsa surfaces down with a 50-50 blend of Elmer's glue, the white Elmer's school glue, and water. And then we put the wet tissue down and waited for it to dry. Once it dried, it was nice and taut. Well, the top we did a little bit different. We used our little glue stick and painted all the surfaces down and put the sheet on dry, and then shrunk it down after the glue had set. We shrunk the tissue down with a blend of 70% water to 30% isopropanol or isopropyl alcohol. And you can probably see here that we got equal results either way. And this has been a test for me. This is the first time I've used two different covering techniques on the same airplane, but also on the same piece of the airplane. In this case, we've got, our wing. Okay, well, with that being said, I skipped ahead. And when I skipped ahead, I went ahead and put the seal coat on. Now, as it stood, after the paper had been shrunk, after our tissue had been shrunk down, it looked really good. It was tight. It was tight, and it also did. It looked really nice. The problem is that if you introduce any moisture to it, well, then it's going to want to break. Let's say you take it out and you fly your airplane on a nice calm morning, and there's a little dew in the on the ground, a little moisture in the air, and you land it in the grass. Well, what you're going to be left with is a soggy mess. It doesn't take much to reactivate that paper and wrinkle it up. So we have to seal it with something. And I've actually pulled off two sealing methods that I've used in the past, and they both work equally well, and we're going to talk about that. Now, I did skip ahead. Let me backtrack just a little bit and advise that, let's see, my train of thought took a dirt road. Oh, okay, before we put our seal coat on and after our paper has shrunk up, our tissue has shrunk up, it's very important that we look at our structure, especially if it's an open framework wing like we have here. We have introduced moisture to balsa wood, a very porous material. We've introduced a lot of moisture to tissue paper, also very porous, very much going to soak it up. We need to make sure that our structure is still square and we don't have any warp before we go to seal it. Okay, if you were to have some warp or twist in a wing, it's very easy to get it out. You can simply, let's say I unintentionally put some wash in or wash out on a wingtip. I could mist the whole thing down again and then put it flat to my workbench, put a little bit of weight on it, in an inconspicuous area, or we could go so far as to pin it to our board if we were doing a homosode or a ceiling tile sheet, and then let it dry again. And oftentimes that's all it takes to take some warp or twist out. But you want to make sure that your structure is completely accurate. It's correct. There's no warp or twist in it before we go on to our seal coat. Okay, and like I said, ooh and ah, this thing looks really good. Look at the shine we've got on it. And it's nice and taut, and it's relatively strong. It's going to be plenty strong in the air, just like your old, 1948 Piper Cub. It's very strong in the air, but it's fragile on the ground. Well, it's the same thing with all of our aircraft. If we build them super strong on the ground, well, chances are they're going to be really heavy, and they're going to fly worth a darn. Anyway, this is very strong in the air, and it is a little fragile on the ground, but, I'm squeezing it pretty good, not putting any, poking any holes in it or anything. Well, let's talk about these two sealing methods. The first one complements the way we did it on the bottom, where we put our painted down the surfaces with our white glue water mixture, and then we put the wet tissue on it and let it dry. Of course, it shrunk up nicely. Well, the way that I used to do it, this is the way I did it when I was 13 years old, building Gilo's rubber band powered model airplane kits. I took, again, our same mixture of our Elmer's glue and our water, and I used a brush. This time I actually went and bought some brushes. But I would mix that up, and then ever so carefully I would soak my brush, and then I would just coat that tissue in nice layer of that 50% glue, 50% water mixture all the way across, and then I would, just let it dry. And that's exactly what I've done here. Now this is actually 3 coats of that glue and water mixture, and what it does is that glue just actually kind of binds everything together and gives us a little, almost a little elastic sheen, and it's worked really well. Now the top, using this is a completely different method that I've used. I have taken the dry tissue and I've adhered it to the structure with our glue stick, and then I shrunk everything down with our 70-30 water alcohol mixture. And this is going to add a little more expense, but it works really fast and it's cool. I used Krylon Crystal Clear. I picked this up for $4 at my local Walmart, and this is a non-yellowing acrylic varnish, if you will. And it goes on just about anything, and this is the gloss. I like the gloss for this. And basically I've got, I don't know, 4 or 5, I lost count, just mist coats. And what I've been left with is a paper that's sealed up nicely. It's going to be somewhat impervious to the moisture in the air and the ground. It'll keep it from, being all nasty and, falling apart on us if it got wet. And it just looks, I think, it looks really neat. Now this effect, I don't have any light down low where I can show you, but, we can see our structure in there. It has a certain amount of translucency. This is so exemplar of the typical airplanes of the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. I don't think that the iron-on coverings actually came to be until, I don't know, was it the mid to late 60s? Anyway, there was tissue for all of the small and medium-sized models, and then up into silk and dope for the larger stuff. And that's what we've got here is, tissue and white glue and water. And on the top, we've got our Krylon Crystal Clear, and that $4 can would probably do several airplanes this size. And, the bottom is done with our brushed on, thinned down Elmer's glue. Our wing at this point is done. Now I do want to put ailerons. I'm going to make ailerons, cover ailerons, but I'm not going to put them on yet because I want to fly this first as a complete 3-channel aircraft. Now we're going to follow these same techniques for the rest of our aircraft. For our fuselage, for our vertical fin, and our rudder, our elevator, and finally our horizontal stabilizer. Now I will leave it up to you as far as which method I've demonstrated here that you might like to try. Personally, I'm going to tell you this is my personal recommendation. The tissue that we're using here is very cheap packing tissue. If you, mind you, I got, 20 sheets for $1 or $2. If you were to go with this material, just like I've done here, showing you a cheap way to do it, I have to say, I would probably recommend putting the material on, putting the paper on dry with the glue stick for your wing. That just worked real well for me when I was putting the tissue on wet, just like I did back in the old days. It was really, really fragile. So you may want to put it on dry and then shrink it after it's glued. I actually think that's probably the best way to do it. Now, if you've gone to the trouble to order some good, I forget the name of it, but if you do a Google search for model airplane Japanese tissue, you'll find a link to the good stuff. Now, the Japanese tissue paper that was used, I think that's what actually comes with the Gilos kits nowadays. It has a very high wet strength. In other words, it doesn't fall apart when it gets wet. And it just operates, works so much better than this really dirt cheap, inexpensive stuff. But do some experimenting and figure out which technique works best for you. Like I said, brushing on the white glue and the water mixture worked really well on the bottom. The Krylon worked really well on the top. This is the best results I've seen using this method personally. I've only used this method one other time, and this worked excuse me, worked really good. Now, I'll leave it up to you as far as what technique that you want to do for the rest of your aircraft. Be sure that you cover all of your surfaces, seal them up nicely. A lot of balsa here, so be sure that as it's drying, as it's setting up, you keep everything nice and flat. It's going to want to warp on you, so keep it flat. Remember how I talked about, we can put a little socket down, something that probably everybody has in their workshop, just something like that to keep everything weighted down while you're letting your paper dry onto your structure. And I think that's it. We're going to be talking about this in podcast episode number 150 for, let's see, the first episode in February 2012. So I'm going to work on this and get it all finished up, and probably the next video we'll end this thing with just a very brief understanding of how I'm putting my electronics and my power system in this airplane, and then we'll be done. One last thing that I'd like to explain. Using tissue paper like this, a lot of airplanes will give you water slide decals. And what I see, this structure is pretty nice, pretty smooth. I wouldn't hesitate to put water slide decals on this, let it dry, and then go back and mist another light mist coat of our Krylon over atop of it again to seal those in. As a matter of fact, you can buy water slide decal clear substrate that you can print on with your inkjet printer, and I actually have some crash cast decals printed out, and I may even go and put some of these on this airplane just for grins. Just to prove how water slide works with this type of cover. Anyway, that's all for now, and I will see you in our next and probably last video for the Mini Intern by Radical RC. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you in a week or so.